Yeah, so again, when Patrick asked me to write for this wonderful collection, I really didn't have any idea that I would have to present or indeed defend my ideas in front of the man himself. But as much as I feel kind of terrified, I feel really lucky to be able uh, to talk about this today, because when I teach Ranciere and when I teach Bourdieu and I talk to my students about Habitus, they really want to understand what is it about these two thinkers, Ranciere and Bourdieu, who had real moments of intersection. What happened? And so I actually wanted to write this not in a self-serving way, but actually because I wanted my students to understand about um, this question. So what I'd like to do today is to expand on the questions about Bourdieu's Habitus and Ranciere's dissensus that I wrote about in Patrick's collection, but of course, which I now have rethought of because of the other people who wrote for that collection, which helped me kind of refine my thinking. Let's remind ourselves that to Bourdieu, we inhabit our origins no matter how hard we try to reinvent ourselves. And our gestures and tics are always on the verge of betraying that extra layer of past selfhood. Habitus is a blatant form of defeatism, it seems. These cultural prejudices, often unbeknownst to us, will continue, for Bourdieu, to be reproduced ad infinitum, like indelible birthmarks or birthrights or absences of birthrights. To Ranciere, however, as much as we may appear to be programmed by our past, our experiences will always be singular to who we are, ready to be revamped and redistributed in the public and the private sphere. He, Ranciere, it's so embarrassing to say he when he's right there. You, Ranciere, you views selfhood as a series of potential histories, expecting it to shed traces of past inequalities by presenting and performing them in a new light. There's always that possibility of performing anew something that we thought we may have been. Nobody is fated to be the passive reflection of his or her social condition. Ranciere's impatience with the Habitus' Sisyphean burden comes from his viewing the human experience as a trajectory with few straight lines. And this morning we had a wonderful talk about the lines. And so the question of avoidance of the straight line, I think, is a very important point. As Rob Sinclair notes, and I'll quote some of the people from the volume, Ranciere demonstrates in direct opposition to Bourdieu that no hierarchical division will ever simply pin bodies to certain occupations, spaces, and temporalities. So we are never what we do. We are never what we eat. We are never what we read. That's not all we are. So Ranciere's work, one might say, could be an ode to an ever-renewed belief that conformity exists only to be dismantled. So when Bourdieu asks, or asked in one of his pieces, how is it possible that the order of the world, and this is, some of them are on your sheet, it's number 1. How is it possible that the order of the world with its one ways, its no enter signs, défense d'entrée, its obligations and sanctions, is not subjected to more transgressions or subversions, more acts of madness? Ranciere pops up right there when I read this. And he would answer, what do you mean there's so few acts? Emancipation can and does happen. The worker who might be the most confined by his habitus, absolutely, and here I'm quoting le philosophe, et c'est pauvre, has the inner freedom to distance himself from the direction imposed upon his limbs, note the physicality, and to claim for himself the dispossessed workplace, to win back from the night the time to read, to write, or to talk. To write or to talk, not as a worker, but as everyone else. As Patrick's collection of essays has shown again and again, one of the disputes around Ranciere's work is possibly, but how? How does this work? How can this work? Ranciere, to me, and I'm sure he's going to pop up and maybe disagree, but has these irresistibly mystical moments where, as Emily Apter writes in her essay for the volume, he has these moments where, in odd, I quote, style indirect libre, he reveals a possibility of a respacing of political sociality manifested in the smallest events. But this style, as he often has, and which can sometimes confuse us, as Flaubert's style confused Pinard and others, can be so protean and eclectic, I'm quoting Léon Sachs, that his narrators seem to also pop out of one of Virginia Woolf's novels, leaving the reader in a kind of Brechtian sort of way, unsure of who exactly is speaking. Like Ranciere, I too believe in what I call, but he doesn't call, these moments of revelation. But my fear is that they may be more short-lived than what appears in Ranciere's work. So how the pause, the hiatus, we're going to talk about that in Murillo's Street Urchins, or as he talks about in the Campement Urbain in Asnières. What if it's just that, a hiatus, and a hiatus that will yield sooner or later, or sooner than later, to the drudgery of everyday life? That is my anxiety when I read and when I love these moments in Ranciere. Bettina Lerner, also in the volume, commenting on Ranciere's work, marvels at how, I quote, he transmits the experience at the edges, very important, where individual voices are so often hard to discern. But Bettina Lerner worries that perhaps it is, I quote, the process of untangling and debating contested meanings that maybe would have required or should require further attention. So not just a moment, but what about that whole process of untangling and debating? Ranciere shows us the moment of visions where someone sees someone or someone takes the time to actually live outside of the dichotomy between work and kind of commodified leisure. But what comes after is my question. What comes after may be an hors texte that we are not privy to. So one of the pressing questions in my mind is, how does Ranciere defend or simply explain the fact that equality is chosen rather than given? And I think this question of the chosen versus the given is paramount. And I'm actually quoting the great poet Anne Lauterbach, who wrote a whole book called The Given and the Chosen. So does it count if it is a mere state of mind that we are experiencing? Is equality not a hard-gained process, one that consists in battling contested meanings? Perhaps this unforgettable passage from Dissensus might clarify matters. So we are witnessing the reported speech of a woodworker, and this is something you all know, of course, from Ranciere. This is a document that he finds published in a workers' newspaper in 1848, and where the speaker reenacts his vision and tells it in the third person to his brother. That is the document. And I'm going to read it, and for some reason I didn't put it in the handout. I apologize. So listen to what this woodworker writes in the third person about his experience. Believing himself at home, he loves to ponder the arrangement of a room so long as he has not yet finished laying the floor. So he lays the floor. If the window opens out onto a garden or commands a view of a picturesque horizon, he stops his arms and glides in imagination toward the spacious view to enjoy it better than the possessors of the neighboring residences. This is a very, very important, I think, passage in Ranciere's work. So my question is, how does this woodworker pull off this singular equilibrium between work and play, between art and duty? I would say, and remember that Ranciere is the great observer of idleness, that it is by performing rather than being subjected to a rare breed of distraction, good distraction, not the kind of distraction, that Greenberg or Adorno are making us hate. Ranciere depicts the razor-sharp relationship this individual has to his reverie. And yesterday, Ranciere made that wonderful opposition that reverie is like the good relative of boredom, or boredom is the evil twin of reverie. So this is, this relationship, he has a very potent relationship to his own reverie. He maps out for himself different parts of the day, juxtaposing what doesn't naturally fit together, the manual and the perceptual, the focused and the formless. In this configuration, even though work remains the central, pulsating artery of his life. I mean, after all, it's because of his work that he is in that room, looking outside to this nature that belongs to something else. But this reverie, this idleness, sets a different part of his brain in motion, yielding to a hedonistic hiatus, the pure pleasure of contemplative experience. Ranciere describes this powerful art of bracketing as a weird and wonderful form of willpower, one that turns idleness into a higher form of experience. The woodworker conveys how he joyfully detaches himself from his work. His imagination is what takes possession of a world otherwise inaccessible. His drifting gaze attaches itself to a reality that he himself helps expand and liberate. It is an exercise in repossession. Ownership becomes an affair of the senses. Owning is no longer just about having, but knowing how to hold through one's eyes. And I think Giuseppina this morning was talking about these memories that we have in moments of reverie, or if someone is creating a poem, that unbelievable second life that you have as a writer, poet, musician, those memories become part of our bank of memories. They're not less significant than maybe the memory of what I did yesterday when I was reading someone else's book. So this woodworker extricates himself so completely, just for that bracketed moment, from his condition, from his worldly successes and failures, that he manages to turn the square window and its panorama into a painted landscape, his own private view of Delft, the inner key to his liberation. Why think of this duality as a conflict of interest? A world split between focus and inattention, dissonance or dissociation, privilege or poverty. Ranciere gives a new name to this divide, this census. He understands it as, I quote, the redistribution in the whole set of relationships between, and this is such a great way of putting it, between capacities and incapacities, a mode of visibility that, I quote, reconfigures the fabric of sensory experience, the fabric, the feel of it, like you're touching velvet or something brittle. Not the first to admit our difficulty with the blurring of work and play, linear and jagged, to go back to the lines we spoke about this morning. This woodworker dreams of a partnership where focusing and drifting can coexist and even turn the mundane into the singularly personal. So confusion, difficulty, and even boredom, but boredom only if it is practiced rather than endured, generate very different rewards from those afforded by disciplined thinking or disciplined working. The longing for dispersal, and now I'm quoting this poet again, Anne Lauterbach, the longing for dispersal, I think that's such a beautiful coinage, longing for dispersal, is far removed from the panic of time wasted. Think about it, longing for dispersal rather than that Calvinistic guilt of time wasted, which we talk about all the time like maniacs. So this longing opens up thinking rather than compressing it into a desired end. Wanting something fragmented is so very different from enduring fragmentation. It builds up the muscularity of attention. And I thought about that reading Ranciere. The muscularity of attention is not the same as some Ritalin, like Adderall, like focus. It's muscular. It's like dancing as opposed to doing some awful gymnastics in the gym, which I never have done. So this disengagement, that peculiarly double way of writing, listening, and looking, has the unique ability of altering our relation to time and being. And I'm not talking about Heidegger here at all. So while Bourdieu gives an overview of the already formed human being, clad in his or her indelible ways, Ranciere captures temporal intervals, changing architectures that develop and are distributed in unanticipated spaces. And I'm quoting one of those people I quoted. I can't remember which one. Is it Bettina Lerner or Rob Sinclair? While Bourdieu focuses on the mannerisms and behaviors shaped by customs and class, Ranciere lets time unfold. It's this kind of incredible luxury he's giving us, and we don't really give it to ourselves, and he doesn't give it to himself, since he just told me he never takes naps. So I don't know about this. So nobody and nothing is immovable in Ranciere. We are potentiality. As Suzanne Gerlach, thank you, quotes in her wonderful Proust piece, Ranciere is a thinker who never loses sight of his fundamental intuition of equality, something that he's had with him, your private, beautiful albatross, I would say. So this fundamental intuition of equality, he never loses sight of it, or of the dispersion or multiplication of capacities and possibilities. This is such a beautiful thing, you know. He never doubts that we can do something more, that there is something in us that we may not even be aware of, a capacity, a possibility. One of the most striking lines from Estasis, and that is your second quote, is that everything can be interesting. It can all happen to anyone, and it can all be copied by the penman. Anyone can grab a pen, taste any kind of pleasure, or nourish any ambition whatsoever. I love that. Everything can be interesting. But that also probably means everyone deserves to have us stop and try and read behind the opacity of a face. Like Jacques Otto, his now iconic maître ignorant schoolmaster, Ranciere always assumes equality between individuals. He believes in their capacity to slip out of their condition, to shed their so-called second skin. Whereas Bourdieu is the archaeologist of our bodily palimpsests, Ranciere is the shaker up, the troublemaker who shuffles categories and uncovers in an indecent way sometimes our singularity. Habitus to Ranciere is unacceptable because it combines the dangers of a Platonic essence that sticks to us no matter what with the no way out prison of materiality. Not surprising then that Ranciere himself delights in eluding definition and consistently breaks away from bodily or cultural genetics. To explore further his phobic avoidance of pinpointed identities, one has only to turn to Jean Bourdieu, whose La Raison Nomade is, I think, one of your great influences. And I'm so happy to be able to give you these lines that Ranciere introduced me to in the introduction. So unlike Bourdieu's eternal return of a recurrent selfhood, Bourdieu, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Bourdieu, comme oreille, Bourdieu, describes the human as embodying two simultaneous movements and affects. We are always past with present, lost and found, traders and servants to one same past. And I'm going to read this because I love this so much. Number 3, the fidelity to the place we come from is also the fidelity to the movement that made us leave it. We are only somebody, anybody, by virtue of that movement. Ever since the borrowed strangeness of our maternal language, we never stop becoming someone else. opened up to others by those singularly uncanny encounters that change our color and our fabric. That is just, if this were a little shorter, it would be my bumper sticker, but I tried and it doesn't fit on my car. I would have to get a mega SUV to get it on there, so it's not gonna happen. So sure, we're bound to our past, wed to handed down traditions and prejudices. Sure, like Oedipus, we can run far from home, but cannot outrun the crisscrossing grids that drove us to where we are now, going back to David's talk this morning. But we are also mavericks, following many other crooked and forked paths, losing and finding the threads that bind to our place of origin. Ranciere neither lets himself be called philosopher, historian, sociologist, anthropologist. Just like the figures he gives voice to, he gravitates toward de-identification and dissensus, processes that welcome the heretical and the disruptive. Myth-breaking is one of his favorite intellectual pastimes. It makes sense then that he would want to debunk Bourdieu's eternal cycle of reproduction as yet another myth, one that will itself continue the propagation of an infernal structuring and reductive process. Peter Hallward writes, Ranciere's most fundamental assumption is that everyone thinks. Everyone shares equal powers of speech and thought. And this equality is not a goal to be attained, but a point of departure. We are all privy to the possible, and that is the basis of radical equality. But to return to our question, how does Ranciere convince us that we are equal? Alison James, in one of Patrick's essays, has shown, quote, in Aesthesis, Ranciere identifies reverie as one of the modes used in the aesthetic regime of the arts to depict emancipatory forms of experience. Crucially, it is a disengaged status of the will from action that motivates his analysis. So the disengaged status of the will from action. That's a really powerful thought. To see how this works, let's follow the street urchins, the little gods of the street that occupy Ranciere's exquisite piece on Murillo's beggar boys eating grapes and melons. These boys, writes Ranciere, are doing nothing. Yeah, well, sorry. Okay, all right. So, but you've so appropriated Hegel that I think you. All right. So Ranciere via Hegel shows these boys as doing nothing and not worrying about anything. Their carefree idleness saves them from being boxed in, sentimentalized, instrumentalized by our need to pity them. Murillo's genius, it appears, is to stop the young urchins from fitting an alleged social condition. The dirt on their bodies, I don't see a lot of dirt right now, actually. The feet. Well, oh yeah, okay, all right. Who was horrified?
Ruskin.
Yeah, Ruskin was horrified by those feet. So, but I think they've been cleaned a bit. All right. Sorry. The dirt on their feet, pardon, contradicts and belies their joyous posture. As hard as we try, our tendency to cast them as poor beggar boys, think Diderot or Greuze, is thwarted by their sensuous reverie. Rather than focusing on the rags and tatters, Ranciere describes they're far niente, they're doing nothing. Again, idleness. And I quote Ranciere, and why did I not put, oh yeah, I have number 4 of your handout. It is important to grasp the power of subversion of this innocent far niente. Far niente is not laziness. It is the enjoyment of otium. Otium is specifically the time when one is expecting nothing, to go back to what you spoke about yesterday. Precisely the kind of time that is forbidden to the plebeian. This is not the lack of occupation, but the abolition of the hierarchy of occupations. The facial expression of the petit dieu de la rue, the little street gods, is a kind of joy. I don't know if so much, we can talk about their expression, but the kind of joy that blurs the distinction between so-called high or low occupations. The patrician occupation, writes Ranciere, is to act. Plebeians are bound to do. These urchins neither act nor do anything. Their bliss partakes of the autonomous quality inscribed in Schiller's idea of play. It is also a crucial step in Ranciere's rehabilitation of free time, in his departure from what he contests as a sociology of hierarchical déjà vu. The dream state, the reveries that transport the two boys into a no man's land outside of class and time, is central, I think, to Ranciere's unorthodox reading of poverty. Indeed, his version of Murillo's dreaming children or daydreaming children will inevitably run circles around any desire to brand, to pity, or to classify. So he opens the essay indeed by quoting Hegel, aesthetics, and this is number 5. But in this poverty and semi-nakedness, what precisely shines forth within and without is nothing but complete absence of care and concern, which a dervish could not surpass in the full feeling of their well-being and delight in life. Perhaps the crucial verb here is to shine forth, and I forget what the French is.
Well, I think it's simply brille.
Brille.
But anyway, it's a translation from German.
Yeah. What would it be in German?
I don't remember.
Ausstrahlen, probably. Okay. Hegel is eager to demonstrate that painting has more to do with the reflection of light, the magical play of shadows, than with the subject itself. But however little the painting may have to do with a social or allegorical agenda, for the form to communicate its core, it needs to form a sharp connection to what it is representing. The play of appearances may be the culmination of its freeing of the spirit, but this also originates out of a lingering concern for content. Number 6. The freedom manifested by the insouciance of the characters depicted cannot simply be reduced to the freedom of indifference. The new concept of art demands that it be the realization of content, of an inner necessary freedom, the freedom of a people that gave itself its own way of life and prosperity, that can rejoice with insouciance about the setting it gives itself after great pains, and rejoice in a disinterested way at the image of this universe, created by artifice, in the same way the child revels in the skipping of a stone skillfully thrown across the water surface. That is Yes, sorry. But it's okay if I confuse you. There's worse people to be confused with. Okay. Ranciere connects the aesthetic experience to a hard-gained history of the body. Even if the boys don't know it, they do benefit from a sense of historical agency. But rather than being subjugated by it, it feeds their ability to cast off oppression. The strength of such a reading is that it does not contain a simple message. The painting cannot be read as a straightforwardly triumphant anti-capitalistic alternative. Instead, Ranciere divests the boys of what we might paternalistically applaud as their bold act of bravado. What actually distinguishes their lazing around is the off-the-cuff indifference to their station. There is no redemptive agenda, just a selfhood without qualities. That is, a state that exists outside of our own obsession with work versus play, productivity versus leisure. Ranciere wants to read the painting against those who might croon at its resistance to productivity. He indeed divests the melon grape eating street dwellers of our own cumbersome teleological gaze, our kind of fixer-upper mentality. Let's make them feel better there. They embody a paradox that Ranciere would summarize as an experience of suspension doubled with that of a people's willpower. Ranciere's genius, if I may say, is to extricate the two boys and along with them his readers from automatic kind of liberal knee-jerk reactions. Without reverting to Kant's purposefulness without purpose, where the beautiful simply is, independent from our needs or projections, Ranciere turns away from the work itself to concentrate on the human capacity to experience autonomy. Dissensus is the defense of a power-free amour de l'art. The love of art does not have to be the result of sinister machinations. Behold how, and I'm quoting again from Dissensus, the spectator, and do I have that in my, I do? Pardon, quel numéro c'est?
7.
Oh, 7, okay. The spectator who experiences the free play of the aesthetic in front of the free appearance enjoys an autonomy of a very special kind. It is autonomy of free reason, subduing the anarchy of sensation. It is a suspension of that kind of autonomy. It is an autonomy strictly related to a withdrawal of power. The autonomy is the autonomy of the experience and not of the work of art. In other words, the artwork participates in the sensorium of autonomy in as much as it is not a work of art. This is astonishing passage with its invocation of a very different type of aesthetic freedom, I think goes far beyond Schiller's notion of play and ultimately liberates us from Lacan and Bourdieu in one fell swoop. Free reason, commodification, or the doomed power play of desire can finally cease to be our aesthetic signposts. It is only once the viewer's fixed ideas are brushed aside that the carefree power of the children will finally emerge. To recapitulate, and this is absolutely central to Ranciere's poetics, the aesthetic experience will have the most likely impact. It will produce the most lasting political upheaval when, I quote, in aesthetic separation, aesthetic community. When, sorry, where I've lost it here. When I quote, the loss of destination, and we're back to David's talk this morning, when the loss of destination that it presupposes disturbs the ways in which bodies fit their functions and destinations. That's what you were talking about this morning. Ranciere fiercely defends a street urchin's right to remain chaotically free, anonymous, unrecognizable, unclassifiable. As Alison James also in one of the wonderful essays writes, they help us partake in an aesthetics blissfully separate and withdrawn from the sphere of instrumental action. I only have one more page. While to Bourdieu, the repositories of culture are stations of the cross. To Ranciere, they are potential sites of liberation. Witness how they speak so differently about our relationship to the museum. Bourdieu's description is full of anxiety. I quote, museums betray their true function, which is to reinforce for some the feeling of belonging and for the others the feeling of exclusion. The world of art opposes itself to the world of the everyday, just as the sacred does to the profane. That is Bourdieu. And of course, I often agree, I have to say. Ranciere counteracts his pessimism with a quote from Deleuze and Guattari. I quote, a monument does not commemorate, it does not celebrate some past event, but it confides to the ears of the future the enduring sensations that it gives to the body, the ceaselessly revived suffering of men, their renewed protest, their relentlessly resumed struggle. Ranciere then turns to the French group of artists called Campement Urbain, urban encampment, and observes that individuals can always rethink their constraint, their alleged inner and outer poverty. In the case of the campement in Asnières, this rethinking leads to an engagement with the new forms and new discontents of social life. Indifferent to the museum and its vicissitudes, these encampment artists, I quote Ranciere, set out to create no more artworks. Instead, they want to get out of the museum and provoke modifications of the space of everyday life, giving rise to new forms of relations. Within the depressed heart of Ranciere, within the depressed heart of Asnières, this group, quote, proposes to create a place that would be extremely useless, fragile, non-productive. And this space, I quote you again, would be dedicated to a specific end, solitude, which in a way, which meant that it would be conceived and implemented as a place that could be occupied only for one person for the sake of lonely contemplation and meditation, a kind of great form of idleness. This is why the project was called I and Us. So the being together apart, I don't know if you're quoting Virginia Woolf's short story here, appears, but also...
Séparés, on est ensemble.
Parce que Virginia Woolf, together and apart, c'est aussi, appears to be more than a poetic sophistication. Constructing a place for solitude, an aesthetic place appears as a task for engaged art. One of the great pleasures of reading you, Monsieur Ranciere, is to partake in the ways you merge the aesthetic experience as political tool with that idea of flânerie, absence of direction. The joyous image of losing one's way, straying from an assigned path, becomes not a source of anxiety, but of energy and renewal. Your aesthetics banks on the fact that something new will happen through the immediacy of the aesthetic experience, not from repetition, not from the dwelling on inequality, but from the performing of equality. So thank you.